welcome to Inside the Issues. I'm Renee Eng in for Amrit Singh. We begin tonight with the latest on the race to succeed Gavin Newsom as governor in California. Now, Friday was the deadline for gubernatorial candidates to file paperwork and officially join the race ahead of the primaries. Now, check this out. This is the current group of major candidates who are running, made up of 8 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Days before, the head of the state's Democratic Party called on lower polling Dems to drop out because of concerns that the vote will be so split among candidates on the left that it could lead to 2 Republicans advancing to November. Now, despite that messaging, none of these candidates dropped out or chose not to file. Now, the state Democratic Party is taking a different approach, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on 6 sets of polls aimed at determining the viability of the Dems running for governor. Now, if that sounds like another effort to get lower polling Dems out of the race, well, you might be onto something. Joe Kwan has more on the race.
There are 8 Democrats running for governor, from current and former mayors, members of Congress, to a billionaire. 2 Republicans are also running, a sheriff and a former news host. That's 10 names that will be on the ballot for the primary election in June. Political analyst Mo Kelly says the more candidates,
the more chaos, the more mayhem. And anytime when you have a large field of candidates, those smaller candidates are going to take votes away from somebody.
And in a jungle primary where the top 2 vote getters go on to the general election, the political expert says there is a chance California voters may be left with 2 Republican candidates on the ballot in November.
Could not happen naturally, could not happen organically. It could only happen if the Democratic Party were to mess this up. And having 8 candidates on the ballot for the June primary is messing it up in a political sense.
Last week, California Democratic Party Chair Rusty Hicks wrote an open letter to Democratic candidates running for governor, asking those who do not have a viable path to the general election to drop out. One candidate did. And now Hicks says the party will be releasing half a dozen polls beginning March 24th.
What this tool seeks to do is to ensure that we all have a clear picture as to what is and is not happening in the race at any one time in the coming weeks.
I would say in response to that, it's too little too late because the filing deadline has passed.
Director of the USC Center for Inclusive Democracy, Mindy Romero, says more choices on a ballot could potentially get more people to the polls because
more candidates, more money, more advertising. You're just reminding people there's an election and you have more people asking people to vote, which could, in that sense, potentially increase turnout.
She says too many choices could also lead to confusion for some voters, which might keep voter turnout for a primary low, as it historically has been in California. During the 2020 primary, voter turnout was about 38%. In June 2022, about 27%. And in March 2024, nearly 29%.
Right, because you don't know, well, who are the people I'm supposed to be looking at, or if you want to think strategically about your vote, or it's just more people to research if you don't already have somebody that you're favoring or already you're familiar with.
Sometimes a big name can get people out to vote, but Kelly says this go around,
it's not a sexy race. Let me put it like that. You don't have the candidate who is just going to be recognizable to anyone and everyone.
And he says with 8 people running in the same party,
I believe the California Democratic Party missed the moment and should have seen this train wreck, my word, coming before it actually happened. There should be no reason that you have this many candidates in a field and then it could turn out and blow up in the face of the party.
The primary election is June 2nd.
Thank you, Joe. And an independent group representing Democratic Congressman and gubernatorial candidate Eric Swalwell is launching its first TV ad this week. It's part of a 7-figure ad buy meant to introduce voters to the congressman amid that crowded Democratic field.
In Congress, Eric fought healthcare cuts, prosecuted the impeachment case against Trump, and he's leading the fight to hold ICE accountable. While billionaires buy false attack ads, Eric's fighting to make California affordable.
Now, that ad makes a subtle reference to attacks from billionaire Tom Steyer, who has accused Swalwell of not having an established residence in California, which would make him ineligible to run. Swalwell has denied that accusation. And Riverside County Sheriff and California gubernatorial candidate Chad Bianco is looking into alleged and unproven voting irregularities in last year's election on Prop 50. That's according to a new report from the San Francisco Chronicle. A group calling itself the Riverside Election Integrity Team claims there were more than 45,000 excess votes were cast statewide during the election. Riverside County election officials and California's Secretary of State's office have refuted that claim. And in a statement to Spectrum News 1, the sheriff's office said, quote, the Riverside County Sheriff's Office is conducting an investigation into alleged irregularities in our elections. The sheriff's office and county officials are committed to safe and secure elections. The Board of Supervisors, County Executive Office, and the Registrar of Voters are fully cooperating in the investigation to ensure Riverside County residents are confident their elections are safe and secure. To ensure there's no miscommunication or conjecture, we will not comment on the specifics or extent of the investigation until it is completed, end quote. And we can also call it the $1 billion question. Will California voters support a 5% tax on billionaires across our state? We'll see coming up. We're taking a live look at the Orange County Registrar of Voters office. All right, it's not exactly buzzing with activity right now, but during the June primary and in the November general election, millions of ballots will be printed, returned, and counted at offices just like this one across the state. And one potential measure you could see on the ballot is the so-called billionaire's tax. It's a one-time 5% tax being proposed on anyone with a net wealth of more than $1 billion. And 90% of the money generated would go towards supplementing health care funds cut by the federal government. And right now, supporters are gathering signatures for the measure to make it on the ballot. But even prominent liberals are split on this issue. Governor Newsom says he opposes it. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders is advocating for it. And as it turns out, California voters are pretty split too. According to a new poll from UC Berkeley Citrin Center for Public Opinion Research and Politico, half of voters surveyed say they would support the initiative. About a quarter said they were undecided, and 28% said they would oppose it. It is also worth noting the proposal currently doesn't have enough signatures to make it to the ballot, and there is some concern it may not meet that threshold by next month's deadline. And today, opponents of the proposed billionaire's tax launched a new poison pill initiative aimed at blocking it. And joining us now is journalist who wrote all about it, Seema Mehta, political writer at the Los Angeles Times. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, opponents of this so-called billionaire's tax on California's ultra-rich will say launch this new strategy. And Seema, can you break down what voters should know about this poison pill proposal that counters the wealth tax?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, voters largely don't know a lot about these proposals because, I mean, they are esoteric. It's like, quite frankly. Yes, you have people, gathering signatures outside of Trader Joe's and Ralph's or Target, saying, hey, do you want to tax billionaires? And people are sort of like, yeah. But once they get in the weeds of it, then it gets a little bit more interesting once they hear the arguments about whether this will actually drive billionaires and, some of the companies that have made California so wealthy and that our state taxes rely upon for revenue, that'll drive them out of the state. And so this one, I actually got this in my mailbox yesterday, which is what prompted me to write the story. It's billed as sort of a ballot measure about transparency and accountability in government. But then if you get your magnifying glass out and you look at the fine text of the language of the ballot measure, it's basically an effort to, like, if the billionaire's tax, if voters were to approve the billionaire's tax, this would be a poison pill. It would nullify it because it would require such new taxes to be put into the general fund, and it would require them to sort of align with existing state policy. And again, I'm sorry, I'm getting in the weeds here, but we have a voter-approved ballot measure that requires roughly 40-ish+% of state funds to go to education. And the billionaire's tax would, 90% of it, A, would be put in a whole separate fund, and B, 90% of it roughly would fund healthcare costs, that are to backfill, cuts by the Trump administration. So while this ballot, proposal looks, it's billed as transparency and accountability, if you look in the fine lines of it, it is clearly an effort to undercut this proposed billionaire's tax. And it's one of, I think, 3 that are out there that are aimed at doing the same thing.
And of course, this primary election is coming up June 2nd. It's going to be here before we know it. Do you think either initiative will make it on the ballot?
Well, I mean, they wouldn't make it on the ballot until November, but they only have, depending on which ballot initiative it is, they only have a couple more weeks or, maybe a month or 2 to make it on the ballot. But we wouldn't be seeing it on the ballot until November. But it is tens of millions of dollars have already been spent on these efforts, and more money is just pouring in. I mean, Sergey Brin, co-founder of Google, he's already put in $20 million into one of the committees that's supporting one of the committees doing this. And there are so many others. So much money is already being spent on this.
And I do want to touch on the governor's race. There are 10 confirmed candidates right now. We have 8 Democrats and 2 Republicans, Steve Hilton and Chad Bianco, who are leading in the polls, and they have the potential to become governor of California. And I'm sure you're aware, California Democratic Party leader Rusty Hicks announced this new polling effort to help narrow down this field. Can you give us more details of this new move?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because usually, back in the day, such discussions took place, in smoke-filled back rooms. And those those days largely don't exist anymore. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But that said, when Rusty Hicks came out last week with a letter, because at that point there were 9 prominent Democrats that were in the mix for the Democrats in the governor's race. When Rusty Hicks came out, the state party chair came out last week saying, hey, those of you who aren't viable, get out before the filing deadline. The filing deadline was this past Friday. If you don't get out before the filing deadline, you will appear on the ballot, regardless of, even if you end your campaign later, even if you endorse somebody else, your name will be on the ballot and you will get a certain number of votes. And for Rusty to come out and to say this publicly last week was kind of remarkable. That said, all but one of them were like, whatever. And they totally ignored him. Some of them within hours of Rusty releasing his letter, filed to run. So it was kind of a total rebuff of what he was trying to do. So this morning he announced, as we wrote about, that the state Democratic Party is going to spend, multiple 6 figures. He didn't tell me the exact amount, but he said multiple 6 figures to poll between now and basically when ballots drop. And, even though the primary is June 2nd, as Californians, since we all get mail ballots, about a month before, the election, it's not election day, it's election month. So we will all be getting our ballots like early May. And so this is a series of polls that will start launching on March 24th. And then I think that's the first one. And there's 5 more that will come before early May. And I understand, I think his purpose is to say, show us, to the candidates, show us, now that you're ramping up your campaigns, now that you're on TV, now that you're really engaging with voters, show us your viability. But that said, the candidates have already said, or basically said, we don't really care what you're saying, aside from one.
Do you think this polling effort will make any difference then down the road?
It could. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. And this is such a weird election because, every other gubernatorial election I've covered, there's always been such a dominant front runner, whether it was, Gavin Newsom, whether it was Jerry Brown, whether it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And you always had somebody in the field who really, they just dominated the race. And we don't have that person this time. So this is sort of uncharted territory for many, many years, well over a decade, possibly almost 2 decades. So I think we're in uncharted territory. We're in a different world in terms of social media, in terms of how voters get their news. In terms of all voters getting ballots, in the mail, as opposed to, having to walk into your, elementary school or your firehouse to vote. So it's a different time and place, and it's a really different electorate.
It makes for an even more interesting race. All right, Seema Mehta, political writer at the Los Angeles Times. Thank you so much for your insight tonight.
Thank you for having me on.
And we have more news ahead. We'll be right back. Keep it here on Spectrum News 1. Heart disease is a leading cause of death in California, a leading cause of death for women and men nationwide. And now a new AI breakthrough is hoping to save lives. Jazz King reports.
They told me that my heart was not well.
While getting her healthy lunch ready, Eve Dion Williams remembers when she had a weird sensation in her leg and jaw 24 years ago and went to the hospital.
They started checking me, and once I got there, they just started ripping my shirt off and was like telling me that I had a cardiac event.
Doctors discovered Eve suffered from hypotropic cardiomyopathy, a genetic disease that causes an enlarged heart. That scared Eve because she was only 12 when her 16-year-old sister suddenly passed away.
When I got her death certificate in 2014, that's when I found out that she died from heart disease. My family never talked about the reason why my sister died.
Heart disease is the leading cause of death in the country, but new artificial intelligence-based technology could help bring those numbers down.
We actually see how hard the heart is squeezing.
David Oyang's a research scientist at Cedars-Sinai Hospital. He helped come up with a new AI-based model called Echo Prime that can read a heart test called an echocardiogram.
It's used to assess the heart's function and size. It helps assess whether someone has heart failure or has a heart attack.
Echocardiograms study 50 to 100 videos to show how well the heart's working. The white part shows the muscle, and the red and blue show the blood flow. David says Echo Prime's the largest ever model created to analyze the reports.
It's trained on 12 million different videos from Cedars-Sinai that actually is mapping what the different videos and images look like and what a clinician would say about the videos and images.
The AI quantifies the heart's motion in the videos, and that helps save time for physicians.
An echocardiogram study takes about an hour. That includes time both by the sonographer as well as cardiologist. Using Echo Prime to create a preliminary assessment, this can save up to 20 to 30 minutes out of that process.
The Mayo Clinic says AIs help reduce false positives for patients by 34%. And David says the new technology could help even more.
It's very common that, a patient can see two different doctors and come up to two different diagnoses. But by having AI assist with the preliminary assessment, this allows for more reliable and consistent diagnoses.
Cedars-Sinai worked with researchers from several healthcare providers to come up with Echo Prime, and the American Heart Association donated more than $10 million to advance AI for heart health.
It's really at the intersection where there's experts both in cardiology, both in AI, and both in computer vision that can bring together a lot of tremendous improvements in the field.
My youngest son was just diagnosed with the same heart disease.
Because of that and her own battle, Eve's focused on one thing.
I want to live. I've always said that I may have heart disease, but it doesn't have me.
With advancements in AI technology and the medical field, Eve's hopeful more heart patients like her and her son will continue to get improved treatment.
Thanks, Jazz. And push is underway tonight to expand mental health access for California youth. It comes after $1 billion in federal mental health grants for schools expired nationwide last spring. Since then, local hospitals have been stepping in to help. Terralyn Wagner takes a look.
There's a softness on the 5th floor of the Chinatown Service Center, with smiling plushies peeking out from every corner. These are spaces designed to comfort young minds as they grapple, in many cases, with things they shouldn't have to experience: trauma, depression, anxiety. The need for help is great, but Emily Erskine of Gateway's Child and Adolescent Outpatient Program says around the country, the resources to meet that need are lacking.
There are so many kids that need services, so many kids, adolescents, I would even say young adults. It sometimes never feels like enough.
Emily is the assistant program director at GCAOP, which recently moved into this building. She estimates that about 90% of their clients are Hispanic, and almost all are on Medi-Cal, with some uninsured altogether. Serving these families has been a challenge, she says, especially since immigration enforcement operations ramped up last summer.
It's been really hard work, and I'm seeing the impact of the political state and the immigration policies on our families firsthand.
Program Director Charlotte Bautista says they're also working to overcome a perceived stigma around mental health.
Families believe that things should stay within the home, and it's really about psychoeducation and informing them that we're here to help, we're not here to judge.
The new facility, they say, has allowed them to expand their program to the largest it's ever been. But this isn't the case everywhere. Last year, the Trump administration cut $1 billion in federal grants that were intended to train more professionals to provide mental health services to young people, particularly in schools. According to the National Association of School Psychologists, the national ratio is over 1,000 students per professional, more than double the recommended caseload. Meanwhile, young people are struggling. The nonprofit Public Policy Institute of California found that 1/3 of the students they surveyed felt chronically sad or hopeless. 14.5% had suicidal thoughts. To help address the need for more mental health services locally, officials recently broke ground on the Los Angeles County Care Community that will transform 6 currently vacant buildings on the campus of Metropolitan State Hospital into a mental health and housing community.
We have residents, many of whom are young people, who are struggling with serious mental illness and need care, structure, and stability.
Gateways is also continuing to expand, with an adolescent inpatient psychiatric center scheduled to open this year in Echo Park. Mental health can be mysterious, Emily says, and being in neighborhoods to meet the needs of the population is vital.
I think visibility is really important. I think education is really important, and helping families feel seen when they're here and helping them feel heard.
A smiling reassurance that help is available.
And before we head to break, take a look at this, a live look at an active eruption from Kilauea's volcano that's located on the island of Hawaii. Quite a sight to behold there. We have more news and politics coming up on Inside the Issues just ahead. We'll be right back. We're taking a look at the White House this evening. The House is adjourned today, and lawmakers are set to meet again on Thursday. The Senate is in session. The Armed Services Committee received a closed-door briefing on the war in Iran. And today, the Pentagon said about 140 service members have been wounded so far. The U.S. military attacked more than a dozen Iranian vessels to try to keep them from laying mines near a major shipping route. Now, Senate Democrats are demanding that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Secretary of State Marco Rubio testify under oath. Harry Lee reports from the White House.
Today will be, yet again, our most intense day of strikes inside Iran. The most fighters, the most bombers, the most strikes. Intelligence more refined and better than ever.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said Tuesday that the war will end when President Donald Trump is ready to end it. That will happen, White House officials say, when Iran no longer poses a credible threat to the U.S.
When we've completely annihilated their Navy, as we are doing, when we've taken out the threat of their ballistic missile capability, when we can firmly, finally ensure that they can no longer make a nuclear bomb to threaten the United States and our allies and our troops in the region. And that's what President Trump is ultimately seeking to do with respect to this operation.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt declined to specify if regime change is part of that objective. President Trump has sent conflicting messages about the war. On Monday, saying that the war was both complete and at the very beginning.
We've already won in many ways, but we haven't won enough. We go forward more determined than ever to achieve ultimate victory that will end this long-running danger once and for all.
Iranian officials remain defiant, with the head of Iran's National Security Council posting that President Trump should watch out or he could, quote, get eliminated. Iran on Tuesday launched new attacks on Israel and several Gulf Arab countries, including Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Both President Trump and Hegseth have warned that the number of casualties is expected to rise as the war continues. At the White House, Harry Lee, Spectrum News.
Thank you, Harry. And joining us now for the latest insight on how this war will impact politics in D.C. and the rest of the country is David McEwen, political science professor at Sonoma State University. Welcome to the show, David.
Well, good evening. Pleasure to join you, Renee.
So, of course, we are now in the second week of this U.S. military action against Iran, and we've seen a series of recent polls on how Americans are feeling about it. What's your biggest takeaway from what you're seeing in the polls right now?
Well, what we see is clearly a partisan split. Not a surprise there, but there's a weakening on the Republican side for looking at that partisan split. You would expect that Democrats would be against this action. That's what poll after poll tells us. But the Republican support, the base support, is weakening a little bit. And that's a product of a number of decisions. The justification for going into Iran and bombing them, the economic impacts, the political impacts that run downstream. You don't have a lot of time for this. And so that makes the next 7 to 10 days in theater, what's happening in and around Iran and the Gulf states, really important in terms of the next phase of this war. And then it also has downstream effects headed to primary elections and the general election, where it starts to affect not just gas prices, but voters' perceptions of the future. And that has important pocketbook and ballot box implications as we head closer and closer to November.
Speaking of November, the economy and affordability, it was a major part of President Trump's campaign in his return to the White House. But, we've seen the stubborn inflation, this economic challenges that are just hanging around since he took office. And of course, now gas prices are set to go even higher because of this conflict. How does all this complicate the message for Republicans heading into the November midterm?
It does complicate for them in this sense. Look, the worst thing that could happen for them is stagflation, some combination of stubborn interest rates, job losses, and, if you will, higher levels of inflation. So that means Republicans have adopted a strategy where they're going to talk about border security, they're going to talk about immigration, they're going to talk about taxes. This sets up quite a bit of a clash, but what it does do is it opens up the number of contested seats. There are about 25 or 26 really close targeted seats that both parties are going to go after in the House, but that number just about doubles to the high 40s, and then it moves into a place where a number of Senate seats are now contested. And that opens up resources for Democrats, it opens up different attack lines, and that means the Trump administration is going to have to go back at this really in a hard way. It also limits their timeline because what's going on is there's a broader recalibration of America's perception in the world, our allies, and this provides openings for the Russians and the Chinese with the Iranians and with other actors in the region, further destabilizing out, if you will, 5, 6 months and longer term, that area of the world that affects American domestic politics, just as it did in 1979, 1980.
I want to go back to this Iran war and its impact we'll see on Trump's base. One big part of his return to the White House was this power of podcasting. For example, taking a show like Joe Rogan, which is seen as influential to his MAGA base. And he said this today on his show about the war in Iran, and I want to play it and get your response. We'll listen to this right now.
What just seems so insane based on what he ran on. I mean, this is why a lot of people feel betrayed, right? He ran on no more wars and these stupid, senseless wars, and then we have one that we can't even really clearly define why we did it.
And he mentioned the no more foreign wars as being something a lot of Trump supporters identified with. How is this impacting that part of Trump's base?
At least two ways. One is that Donald Trump built a coalition that was unusual, that Democrats, that were lost or crossed over, working individuals, folks that shower, if you will, after work, not before work, folks that, if you will, constituted heavy Latino and African-American male contingents that crossed over just a little bit, that eroded and gave him that 1.5 point, 1.5 point victory. But if you look at this relative to the polling that we're seeing in the earlier comments just a moment ago, when you look at that, there's a bit of a weakening there, a bit of a fraying, and that means that the voter segments that delivered him to the White House, even though he's not on the ballot in 2026, there's a weakening there, and that really frustrates and worries Republicans. They felt quite buoyed coming out of the State of the Union, and then there's this event, and then talk about Cuba or what's going on elsewhere in the world, and that's all unsettling Capitol Hill Republicans. That affects not just legislation for what comes next, it affects those close marginal districts that begin to double in size, laying out more targets, and a weakening because of the fragile Trump coalition that brought him in the office, but isn't necessarily sustained and worried about the future, an economic future around affordability and an America future around the world and its engagements. That's where this Iranian aggression could be really costly for the Trump administration into the summer or fall period.
And let's check in on the other side of the political aisle. Democrats in the U.S. Senate, they're demanding public hearings over this conflict. The Trump administration has so far only had classified testimony to members of Congress. What do you think is the likelihood of public briefings actually happening?
I think you could see public briefings after hostilities wrap up. So if you're the Trump administration, you want to go slow into that fair wind. The way you do that is you push those out as long as possible where you're trying to wrap up the hostilities. Here's the difficulty of that. Prior to the war, there were an estimated 80,000 drones in Iran. If you knock out just half of those, you're still in a place of 40,000 or so drones. Therefore, that can widen the war. And what happens? That affects our Gulf cooperation allies. It affects what happens in theaters that are quite fluid, like Syria and Iraq and Libya, expanding the war. So the Iranians have some place to go here, even though the Trump administration would like to wrap this up because there's a worry of what the domestic impact could be. And that domestic impact rolls to Capitol Hill and what happens there as well.
I do want to ask you this before we let you go. Tonight, we have a series of primaries in Mississippi and Georgia, and one of those races is to replace that seat that was left vacant by Marjorie Taylor Greene. And of course, this comes 1 week after last week's primary in Texas. What are we learning so far from the early primaries in 2026?
Democrats have generally overperformed, but if you look at that 14th congressional district in Georgia, it's a safe Republican district, but there's a bit of a wild card there, and that's Marjorie Taylor Greene herself and what role she plays there in terms of influence based on a constituency there. It's not that a Democrat wins that district, it's that Democrats try to do better in those areas, and that gives a little bit of a pall and a worry for Republicans. So they're going to have their confab, they're going to look at this, and they're going to say, what do we need to do? And that's where immigration, crime, border security, those issues become absolutely important to how they push back against Democrats in all of those congressional districts, not just in the 14th in Georgia, but across the country as we head to November.
All right, David McEwen, political science professor at Sonoma State University. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you, Renee.
And coming up, the GOP is trying to keep its slim congressional majority in this year's midterms. But this week, the president is campaigning against one House Republican. That's coming up on Inside the Issues. Take a look at the current balance of power in the U.S. House. Republicans have a slight majority with 218 seats. Democrats have 214 seats after winning a special election in Texas last month. That means Speaker Mike Johnson can only afford to lose a single vote from his caucus to advance legislation on party lines. There are 3 vacancies. And one of those vacancies is a seat previously held by Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, Greene left office in January, and tonight Clay Fuller, a Republican backed by President Trump, and Democrat Sean Harris advanced to a runoff to fill that seat. Evan Kozlov has a story.
The big takeaway from this race is that we're heading for a runoff in April because no candidate got 50% of the vote. That's not terribly surprising because listen to this. There were 17 people that entered this race, meaning a lot of the Republican votes were just carved up among various candidates in what's considered to be a deep red district. So let's talk about the 2 candidates who are now moving forward to the runoff. First, there's the Trump-backed Republican. It's a local DA named Clay Fuller. He will be facing off against the Democrat Sean Harris, who actually ran back in 2024 and lost by 30 points to Marjorie Taylor Greene. This race has really gotten outsized attention for who is being replaced. We've been talking about it. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was a major supporter of President Trump before they had that big, ugly public break, in large part due to the Epstein files, ultimately leading her to announce that she'd be stepping down this January. As for what clues these results may offer about the midterm elections, it's going to take some time to dig through the numbers before we get the full picture. In Washington, I'm Evan Kozlov, Spectrum News.
Thank you, Evan. And for Republican candidates, an endorsement from President Trump is usually seen as a strategic advantage. But this week, the president will visit Kentucky to campaign for a candidate running against a Republican incumbent. Aaron Kelly has more on Congressmember Thomas Massie and his complicated relationship with the White House.
The Republican Party of Kentucky announced Sunday that President Donald Trump is about to pay a visit. A social media post says, quote, join President Trump in Kentucky as he lays out his vision to keep America's economy red hot and firing on all cylinders. The event is scheduled for Wednesday at a packaging facility in Hebron, Kentucky, less than 15 miles from Republican Congressman Thomas Massie's Northern Kentucky office. Massie has repeatedly defied the president, notably voting against the president's signature tax and spending law last summer, saying it didn't cut the deficit enough, and pushing for the full release of files related to sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. President Trump is backing farmer and former Navy SEAL officer Ed Galrine in the Republican primary against Massie. Galrine said in a social media post that the president is coming to the district to support Galrine's bid for Congress, and, quote, this will be an exciting rally with supporters from across the region coming together. Massie made light of the situation with a post about the invitation, writing, quote, I'm sure it's in my inbox somewhere.
Massie's campaign told me the congressman has a previously scheduled official event that day and will not be attending the president's event. In Washington, Aaron Kelly, Spectrum News.
Thank you, Aaron. And still ahead, it's been more than 2 years since the land began moving under dozens of homes in Rancho Palos Verdes. And many homeowners say they're still waiting for relief. That's just ahead. Today, LA Unified Superintendent Alberto Carvalho issued his first statement since the FBI searched his home and office last month. The investigation is reportedly linked to an AI chatbot the district launched in 2024. The company failed soon after, and Carvalho is on paid leave. He has not been charged with any crime, and his law firm issued this statement that said, quote, Mr. Carvalho remains confident that the evidence will ultimately demonstrate that he acted appropriately and in the best interests of students. We hope the school board reinstates him promptly to his position as superintendent. And it's been more than 2 years since historic land movement began in Rancho Palos Verdes, damaging dozens of homes. The city offered to buy out some homeowners, and Ryan Thompson spoke to people who say they are still waiting and running out of patience.
Well, it's like living in the country in the city.
When retiree Michelle Smith bought her 2-acre lot in the Portuguese Bend section of Rancho Palos Verdes, she thought it would be her forever home.
40 years, it was all smooth. It was the 40th year that it started going down.
What started as small cracks around her property eventually gave way to erratic land shifts, leaving her home not just unlevel, but also unsafe.
The floor started to split apart. The beams started to split apart. Everything started moving.
Despite pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into repairs in a bid to do whatever possible to stay put.
Finally, my husband said one day, hey, it's time. This isn't working. We put a lot of money into it. We've been trying to save it. This side dropped.
Now she's living in a nearby home half the size, waiting for what's next. She applied and was accepted for a 2024 city program that would buy out property in landslide areas based on pre-disaster prices. But despite city promises for swift action to alleviate financial stress, no homes have been purchased yet.
Who knows how long it's going to take? A year, 2 years, 3 years?
The Palos Verdes Peninsula has been grappling with landslides long before it was incorporated. But heavy rains in 2022 widened the impact area and the severity. Research from NASA now shows some land moving as much as 4 inches every week. And for city manager Ara Maranian, the local response has since become a $64 million financial burden.
What was being managed for many years and people living with it turned into something very catastrophic.
But despite all that spending, the city has not yet been able to make good on its promised purchase of 22 red tag homes. Its application to FEMA for key federal emergency funds hasn't yet been submitted.
I wish it would be moving a lot faster, but I also understand the complexities and the amount of information that needs to be gathered in order to submit a complete application so that when it does get to FEMA, the process and the review can be expedited.
And for the 63 homeowners who weren't accepted into the city's initial buyout, they may get a second chance. The city council discussed additional emergency grants that have come into view, potentially providing enough to purchase 13 additional homes.
It was so hard for my heart to get from here to there.
But financial security doesn't always make moving on any easier. And as Michelle says goodbye to the home where she raised her family, she knows it will always hold a piece of them.
You know, we're here. We're all still here. And so I have, a good memory.
Good memories of a house they used to call their forever home.
Thank you, Ryan. And today, LA Mayor Karen Bass announced more police deployments in downtown Los Angeles. The announcement comes after a street takeover near LA Live over the weekend. And some of the crowd vandalized a residential building nearby. Here's Mayor Bass.
This is why we are announcing today the specific deployment of LAPD officers to the area around Circa and LA Live, all the way up to the shopping center at Figueroa and 7th. This special deployment is a combination of patrol cars, bike patrols, foot patrols to protect everyone who lives and visits here.
Bass also said the deployments would help protect events at the nearby convention center. And one local art fair recently showcased the work of more than 40 independent Black artists, offering them a space to show and sell their work using a unique business model. The experience made its LA debut last month in conjunction with LA Art Week, and Ray Williams takes us there.
His story began long before he was holding brushes in his hand. For Mr. Wash, art was a lifeline.
My journey as an artist started in federal prison after receiving a wrongful conviction and life without parole. Art became the medium that helped me cope with prison, as well as to tell the stories of my incarceration and my flight to my children, and my generations to come.
And at Butter, a Black fine art fair in Inglewood, he's turning lived experience into live art.
Most of my art is the subject of a human story. My story is 1/5 of the work that I've created.
But even with an established body of work, access to traditional art spaces remains one of the steepest climbs for Black artists like Mr. Wash.
I think the biggest challenge that I see in the art industry is being able to be shown in a gallery space or museum space.
And for the founders of Butter, which began in Indianapolis, opening those doors to underrepresented artists is the mission.
Well, you started the Butter Fine Art Fair to amplify the voices of Black visual artists around the world.
Artists here pay no fees to participate. There's no commission on sales and no censorship of their work, a rare structure in the industry and one significant to Black artists. A report by Burns Halperin found Black artists account for roughly 2% of overall art market sales.
You know, you're talking about a culture of a people that built an entire nation, that is the culture of an entire nation. And, you know, having our art as a mainstay and the authenticity and the truth behind it and allowing it to breathe and to live on its own terms is really something that Butter is able to do.
And at Butter, value starts with ownership.
We believe that artists deserve 100% of what they're asking for. And we know that that's just a starting point to have a larger conversation about worth, about value, and about the significant contribution of Black artists to the world and to our country, you know, and so the least we can do is offer 100%, and also we can offer care and love and conversations about power.
For Mr. Wash, standing here among artists who look like him and collectors who see him is part of that power.
This is a very unique experience for me, so I'm taking it in as I go. But I feel extremely grateful to be celebrated and honored amongst these great artists.
From Indianapolis to Inglewood, Butter stretching the canvas for Black artists.
Thank you so much, Ray. 42 artists featured there in that fair, and that does it for us tonight. That's a wrap for this edition of Inside the Issues. We want to thank Seema Mehta and also David McCune for being on our show tonight. And thank you all for watching, and keep it here on Spectrum News 1 for more of the best hyperlocal stories in your community. We'll see you soon.